Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. We are online at what-s-left.webnode.com, and you can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, share your favorite episodes, and jot down our information wherever you found this episode, if you can. My name is Andy Lipson. I'm a socialist and teacher. We're rejoined again by Kenny Zepeda, socialist and community organizer. And again, we have our guests, Jessica, who teaches English literature, writing, and environmental humanities at the university level in Pacific Northwest. She's been teaching college students for 8 years and holds a PhD in English. She's a longtime animal rights activist and environmental activist. And you also see here, we have John Kleisik as a guest today, the author of a School Board Order, The Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education. And he is a frequent contributor to Unlimited Hangout. So first off, Kenny, welcome back.
Thank you.
And Jessica and Jake, welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we're missing Eduardo. He is once again traveling to another part of the world. So he's not going to be here today.
Eduardo, you're not getting a pay raise. Just kidding.
So this episode is going to be a little bit different. The idea for this episode actually started with an episode of James Corbett. What does James Corbett do? It's the Corbett Report. And he was responding to a question. The episode was titled, "What is the Trans Agenda?" Definitely people should check it out. And somebody was asking him, is there a connection between the movement for transgender rights and the goal of transhumanism, or was implying, is there a connection? I found this what he was saying interesting because it brought up a lot of thoughts and feelings for me. It's something I ended up discussing with Brandy. And then when I was talking to Jessica about potential future issue that we could discuss on What's Left, Jessica brought it up. And Jessica, what was on your mind when you brought it up?
I just think it's kind of an aspect of this whole, thing, global reset, that maybe hasn't been touched on as much. And so I just felt like it'd be an interesting conversation. I think it's also another example of a topic that is so incredibly polarizing and so taboo. I feel like in the world of academia, like it is even more forbidden to critique, particularly the transgender rights movement, if that's what we want to refer to it as, even more so than a lot of the sort of COVID related stuff, which is really saying something. So I think it's just a rich kind of area. And I thought the Corbett segment did a pretty nice job of sort of like concisely articulating this argument for a connection between transhumanism and transgenderism. I think there's a lot more to it, which maybe we'll get into. But I just thought it would be a rich jumping off point for a conversation.
Yeah, and I felt the same way in terms of even before talking to you, I felt like when I was going to bring it up to Eduardo and Kenny as something, hey, maybe we would talk about this. Although Eduardo was leaving and Kenny was gone, I was nervous about talking about it for the same reasons. It's like the cancel culture, the sense of if you say something wrong, it's going to come back at you and things like that. So I feel that same sense of fear in the topic. But again, What's Left, our goal is to say we want to open these things up for discussion, because if we're going to be liberated, if we're going to liberate ourselves and liberate humanity, we're going to have to be able to talk about these ideas and not be forced to feel like, oh, I've got this right, but here's what I'm thinking right now. What do you think? And so, when I listened to what James Corbett was saying, or let me first say this, I do believe the transgender population is an oppressed group. I think they've been oppressed, or like they have been low person on the totem pole in the LGBTQ movement historically. That's my feeling. And I appreciate what is brought into the notion of gender fluidity. And it has actually meaning for me, even though I don't identify as transgender, but as feeling forced into male roles, I actually appreciate movement which actually says, these things are fluid. So I'll just say that. But what I think James Corbett was attempting to say, and I'll just try to see if I get this right, was even that he was recognizing that there is some oppression that exists among the transgender people who identify as transgender. But he's basically I think what he was saying was this movement, which is about the fluidity of gender roles, is a movement that has really being utilized now, particularly as it's more recently been popularized. He's speaking of its more recent popularization by the agenda to essentially a transhumanist agenda, which is essentially to strip people of their physical bodies and put them into computers and have them live forever. Now, I think the transhumanist agenda is generally speaking of the future for the wealthiest, generally, but it is. I think that's what he's saying, is that there's a connection between this recent move, what he's describing as a recent transgender, or its recent popularization, and an acceleration towards a transhumanist agenda that he sees as a result of the things we've recently seen around COVID and the fourth industrial revolution and more data-driven stuff. So that's my first take on that. And maybe I want to see if anybody wants to add anything to see if I've got it right in terms of a rough characterization of what Corbett was saying.
Yeah, because the sense I got was that this is kind of a stage in the progression, right, towards that transhuman, world that, it's not so much whether, at least the way I understand it, whether, fighting for or against transhuman rights it's right. It's more about like it's part of the narrative that's being fed to us, and that, it's creating the condition where, again, the cancel culture, that we're not allowed to question this fundamentalist mindset that which ironically is a binary, right? Either you're with it or you're against it. And if you're against it, you're out. And like he brought up J.K. Rowling, right? The writer who was canceled for making comments and labeled, and that brings up also Dave Chappelle, right? That recently was under the storm of cancel culture, and other people that are not necessarily trying to impose anything, or don't even have the power to really impose something on people, but yet they're just thrown to the side, and there's no challenges to the orthodoxy of the mainstream narrative.
Yeah, I think he was also looking at just the timing of it in terms of how it coincides with like all these other reset movements, and then also why it is heavily politicized and lots and lots and lots of media attention at this particular moment that could lend itself to the transhumanist movement. So that's the only other thing I would add to that. But basically, yeah, it's the same idea. Yeah.
So here's where I agree with James Corbett. I do believe that the capitalist class is using. First of all, I do believe that the capitalist class is using some ideology of the transgender movement that has been kind of hijacked from it and using it to push their agenda. Do I think it's a transhumanist agenda? I think maybe they think it is. I still think it's a profit agenda that's the material basis of it, and collecting more data and people and the rich separating themselves into a place where they can live forever. I could see that they want to do that, but ultimately for me, the drive is profit. That's what I believe is driving it, not the goal towards transhumanist. But I do agree that there's people out there and a whole host of people out there pushing towards that way and willing to essentially hijack an existing movement to use it towards its aims, towards its end. But this is not unusual. Black Lives Matter racism exists, and yet the ruling class can use a movement like Black Lives Matter to push on identity politics and have a black defense person be the person who's bombing all over the globe in the name of fighting racism. And you can see it with the Me Too movement, and how the capitalist class can use that to target each other essentially, and also use their so-called fight for women's rights to justify bombing Afghanistan and Iraq into oblivion, saying those countries are lesser because we honor women's rights. They don't. We'll blow them up. Okay. So, and even you can see in immigrant rights, they can take elements of immigrant rights, promote something like DACA, and say, oh, while they're essentially brain draining the other countries, basically taking some of their people who've had often the most skills and been trained, and they strip them and take them into their country. They say, oh, we're doing these people a favor, while essentially they're just taking some people who are highly qualified and using them in their country to exploit their labor. So the capitalist class has a rich history of taking existing movements that have a legitimacy of their own and using them against workers. And the biggest problem I have with what James Corbett does is he actually takes the capitalist use of it and then denies the fact that there's actually a working class element and actually a working class basis for the fact that workers will be benefited from a more fluid understanding of gender, and a capitalist fluid understanding of gender. Yes, it's going to involve technology, it's going to involve profits, but I actually believe a working class understanding of gender fluidity, which I do believe is there, could be liberatory and would be liberatory in the context of actual class struggle, which this movement was not produced as a result of class struggle. It's a movement from above. So, of course, James Corbett doesn't see it that way. He's not a Marxist, but I actually believe what it does is it leads him to actually scapegoat transgender folks and misidentify the actual culprit again, which would be the capitalists using somebody else's ideology or somebody else's fight in the name to smash workers here, not just transgender folks, but all of us, because it's essentially is trying to essentially build that fourth industrial transhumanist, use worker data to create a world that in which the capitalists can kind of live forever as brains in a computer. So that's my first take on it.
Can I respond?
Mm.
So I agree with your kind of the parallel you're drawing in terms of the corporate like usage, infiltration, manufacturing, I would even say, of a movement, the parallel between BLM and the trans rights movement. I would draw a pretty stark comparison, and I feel like I have a pretty different perspective, not of your characterization or any of your characterizations of the link James Corbett's drawing, but just of the characterization of gender, right? Like I'm kind of coming from like more of a radical feminist ideology, I guess. And so for me, like BLM, even though it's kind of become like a corporate motto almost, right? And Amazon's jumping on board and Boeing's jumping on board, right? And it really has become corporatized, right? Even though you have like real grassroots, like the New York chapter, right? Like they're totally against the mandates. They've split with the national organization, right? I would argue BLM has like at least some legitimate roots in actual left-wing pro-worker resistance, like resistance to the state, resistance to the state's monopoly on violence. Like, to me, there's no question, right? Black people are frequently and systematically denied human rights. Police brutality is real. Racism is real. I see the trans movement as different. I mean, I really do see it as a corporate manufactured fiction that harms women and girls. And I think, I mean, this is again like coming from a more of a radical feminist understanding of gender. And I think maybe we should talk about just that word and like what even, like I'm really curious to hear your perspective, Andy, when you said sort of like you do actually see it as gender fluidity as part of like the pathway to liberation. I think that's kind of what you said.
Yeah.
To me, like I think, I mean, transgenderism, like to me, is actually a right-wing ideology because it's dedicated to kind of reinforcing this whole idea of masculine and feminine, right? Which under capitalism and under patriarchy it's dominant and subordinate classes, right? Like this is how radical feminists refer to ourselves. Women are a sex-based class. And so it's almost always highly dependent on kind of outward appearances, stereotypes, right? You know, and I think we'll get into this because I know, Jake, like you brought up like Judith Butler and queer theory and right, like those like post-humanists, I guess, would kind of classify some of these outward expressions as like progressive or as transgressive, right? But a lot of times, like it is defined by clothes, makeup, like these kind of performances of femininity or masculinity, right? Which the whole thing like depends on sex stereotypes, right? Like if you wear lipstick or you want to wear a sparkly dress, right? Like as if that somehow kind of makes you a woman. And so I just want to kind of bring up the radical feminist critique of gender, right? Like our goal as feminists is actually to abolish that whole idea of gender, right? To get rid of it completely, because we see it as an ideology that forms basically like the foundation for women's subordination. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I want to hear people's responses.
Either Kenny or Jake.
I can just sort of talk about where I'm coming from, if that's fine. I'm just super reticent, and I'm nervous for two reasons. I mean, because one is for the same reason, you know, Jessica is nervous. I mean, you know, I'm a white guy and who's considered the token right wing guy or alt right. I'm like already like, you know, I'm going to be potentially misunderstood. And then the other thing is, I do think I over prepared, and I'm afraid that if I'm feeling reticent about both things. But so I agree. Okay, so let's start with this. Like, as far as Corbett, like, I would say that he didn't spend a lot of time, you know, identifying with or sympathizing with the realities of transgender people and their struggles for rights. But I didn't see it as him conflating that identity group with transhumanism, like a 1-to-1 ratio, or conflating like the movement for transgender rights like 100% with transhumanism. Now his analysis, that was 100% or 99% what he focused on, but he did have caveats in there, you know, to say basically like, I'm not saying that all transgendered people are on board with this, and that, you know, you can just say that one is the other. And so I agree with you, Andy, that you know, that the corporate hierarchy, which I would basically say is more than the capitalist class, they're eugenicists at the very top, that they do conflate or co-opt all the various movements we're talking about. So movements for workers' rights, movements for women's rights, movements for Black people's rights and other people of color, movements for transgender people's rights. And you can see it in all the rhetoric of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Great Reset. So the working class is when they talk about community-based this, community-based that, this communitarian stuff, which basically is pulling on the root of communism. And then when you look at, they have the ESG status for the companies, which is your environment, social, and governance. Under the social acronym is, right? So they want to, you got Nike and Amazon, like, yeah, we support BLM, and yeah, we support gender equity. So all these different groups fit into this Great Reset paradigm as a mode that is co-opted for technocracy. So I agree with all of that. My analysis of how the transgender movement, we'll call it, is being hijacked or co-opted by the technocracy and the oligarchs at the World Economic Forum. I want to look at it philosophically more, and in terms of the metaphysics of the philosophies that they use. And when I say metaphysics, a lot of people think that means like new agey, like spiritual stuff. It just means first causes or first principles. So based on based on their philosophy of their whatever their ESG movements are, or their community based projects. Like what is their metaphysic? What is their principle that actually all of that ties on? Because if you just listen to the language at the surface level and you listen to it at a very superficial level, the ethos sounds like, right, it is trying to help all these people. But if you trace the philosophy back, you will find that it ultimately, well, let me just do this real quick. That way, I don't know if this is going to fit, right? So what I wanted to, that's not, I'm too close. I don't know if this is, so what I wanted to do, and this is what I think Corbett was trying to do here, is it on screen? There's a big light on it though.
Yeah, here's what we'll say is what, but
don't erase it before you take a picture of it.
Exactly.
Oh, it's on paper too. I did it on paper first, and then I did it colored. Anyways, it took me all day because I got so many different things moving around. If I try to just remember it, I won't be clear, right? So what I think he was not saying. Well, let me start with this. My analysis is looking at it like this: the transgender people and the transgender community, that their struggle for rights is being politicized by certain philosophies in order to push a transhumanist agenda. Okay, and the root of this philosophy, the two that I want to look at, is one called, as Jessica mentioned, was queer theory, which Butler frames as performance identity, which basically means an identity without essence. That's why LGBTQ, it's not LGBT, and we assume that they're all queer, right? So first off, I'm not saying that all transgender people are queer or that they adhere to performance identity. Okay, I'm also not saying that all transgender people are transhuman or adhere to transgender ideology, and thereby, right, I'm transgender people are humans, right, and therefore deserve human rights, equality, liberty, grace, all these things. But where the philosophy sort of moves into the political realm, I would call that the identity politics, or what sometimes is called cultural Marxism. And I know that some people don't like that term, but that's the term that I'm going to use. And then that feeds into the economics, and the economics is, Andy, what you're looking at, that's the I would call it transhumanist consumerism, because in order to basically, in this paradigm, the Great Reset paradigm of transgender identity, that to actually express your transgender identity, you necessarily have to undergo the various surgeries and procedures. That means that you basically have to use biotech. And so it's pushing, and then you're going to be on hormones. So there's big pharma, there's biotech, and that's the element where corporate profit and corporate industry comes into play. And then another layer to the idea of the performance theory is something called thing theory. And that just basically means that an object becomes a thing once it is misused or used in a way that transcends or transgresses its traditional or common use value. So basically what you're saying is, in the politics, it's race and sex without essence. In the realm of philosophy, it's identity or objects without essence. And in the economics, it's basically your biology and nature or the environment without essence, right? Without essence, we mean there's nothing that makes you human. If there's nothing that makes you human, you're the same as any other raw materials that can be commodified and manufactured. And therefore, at the end of it, the vacuum that's left in this essenceless space is power and efficiency, which is corporate technocracy. Okay, so I'll stop there. I mean, I want to talk about how deconstructionism touches into that, but that's enough jargon for now. And so I just wanted to, so for the rest of this, when I'm talking, right, I wanted to distinguish the philosophy, the politics, and the economics from the people themselves and their, genuine and legitimate struggle to be humans in the way that they see fit.
So the fact that now we have three different people who are confusing our viewers. Andy's confused by what Andy said, and then Jessica, and then Jake. Now we get a fourth person. Kenny, you can now confuse folks.
I'm confused myself, but I'm processing a lot. That's what I wanted to be part of this, conversation. I am a Marxist. I see it from a materialist point, maybe a little reductive in the sense of, like I generally find an issue that this is what happens when we talk about identity and because it's hard really to define identity and that's why I'm a materialist, because, and also like Gramsci, right? Like I tend to look at the world and look at the hierarchy from above, and the dominant values come from the top. We tend to think, and I think that's what Corbett was saying. That's what I read, that these narratives, and that's why I focus on the narrative, that is becoming dominant in culture, and they are created the conditions for the capitalist system, because just like you, Lipson, I do see it as profit, not so much as the dominant ideology that I see at the very top is profit. In the process, they capture all these segregated movements that I think fail to understand the way I understand the world. Doesn't mean I'm right, but in the sense of we will never see each other eye to eye on those lenses, and I will never be able to define or even try to define what is it to be a man or a woman, and I think that's the point of those roles, to divide and conquer, and of course patriarchy, precedes modern capitalism. But from a Marxist materialist perspective, as I understand it, and it's a little maybe simplified, it's like whoever dominates the means of life dominates culture, dominates, just like men, right? Like they dominated that, and so they impose those rules on women historically. And but I think this is where this is getting reversed, right? Like just like that. We're talking about not oppression, liberation, but it is more oppression, really, because it's dividing us even more, because it is so confusing to define. I would never, that's something that I talk to my people. That's why I hate identity politics so much, because who is going to put a hierarchy over what? I've had people, that want to impose because they're oppressed of one kind over others, and yet, so that's my point, that we're confused and we keep getting confused and segregated in fights, and either you're in it or you're on the other side, while the system continues to operate and take advantage of these arguments. And not to say that I don't want to be part of this. I think it's important to understand, but at the end of the day, to me too, it's also the fact that these conversations need to be had among normal people, and like, honestly, like I consider myself relatively educated, but I get lost. The most people won't engage. And so that in itself tells me that a lot of, these complicated philosophical, theoretical conversations work against us, the people that are getting the burden of it. And the only true way to understand each other is on a personal level, gaining trust in the struggle, because, all of us here, we have different identities, and, we would never, again, I can label myself, an immigrant, brown man, and then, from a third world country, and, who's vaccinated now. And I can add all these layers. And so what I get from Corbin, again, just to bring it back, it's not so much like whether, trans people deserve or not deserve. What I get is that, just like you said, Lipson, Black Lives Matter, all these movements get co-opted for the purpose of profit, and I do see a link for what you were saying, Jake, that there, now I see that, oh yes, it makes sense, more people, wanna, change who they are. But then that brings me into things that I think are products of capitalism, dissatisfaction. And this is the Buddhist in me, like the dissatisfaction and not being okay with being human, not being, because we're flawed and not accepting that we're flawed and we're decaying and dying every day, not accepting those things, and again, I'm not saying that I'm also afraid, that I don't want to say that, trans people don't have struggles, but that's not for me to judge. That's not what I'm here to say. What I'm trying to say is that the narratives get co-opted. And that's what I want to say, be careful with that. Be careful with falling into that militancy of this is my identity, and in that way, accepting some sort of queerness about yourself, of being fluid in terms of everything, perspectives and who you are at any time. So long as it's independent, right, from these forces that want to pin us against each other. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of my spiel to confuse people.
Can I make a comment maybe to try to tie Jake's point and Kenny's point, or part of them, together?
You can, and because I'm going to respond a little bit to yours, so go ahead and do it.
Okay. Because I, at the risk of sounding militant, Kenny, I wanted to just pick up on something you said about, I think first you said like it's hard to define identity, and I totally agree. But then you said you would never try to define like what it is to be a man or a woman. And I mean, I want to push back on that a little bit. I think maybe like we could use femininity and masculinity. Like, I don't know how you're supposed to define those, because it's like I said before, like it's not, a dress or, the way you walk or whatever. But I mean, I think to try to maybe tie like the materialist approach to some of the queer theory, which I was saying to Jake over email earlier, that like the first couple of years of grad school, everybody was like obsessed with queer theory at that time. It was like, oh God, like 2013, 2014, like right around there. And like, I was just like a brand new fresh grad student, and I read Judith Butler, I read a bunch of the queer theorists and like postmodern feminists, and I just could not wrap my head around it. Like, it was so confusing and so alienating as a woman. So anyway, all that to say, like, where I'm kind of going with this. So people like Judith Butler and queer theorists, right? They kind of claim that transgenderism is transgressive, and that it's even like revolutionary or liberatory, right? Because the idea is that it sort of destabilizes the gender binary, right? Or like that border. Feminists, as I said before, like feminists argue that gender is the foundation, like, of the whole political system of male domination, right? And so, like, to me, with the whole performativity thing, like, there's this weird thing with queer theory too, where it, like, this like idea of like play and like playing with gender, and to me that feels kind of like a fetishization. I think it is a fetishization, and I think, maybe for some people it is kind of like fun and games, right? But to bring it back to sort of like a material, like, what is the actual experience of human beings? Like, I would pose to those queer theorists, like, I want to know how a woman about to be raped by a man, is supposed to sort of play or like perform her way across that gender binary, right? Or like identify such that she doesn't get subjected to like one of the most brutally violating acts, right, in existence. And so I was actually pulling some of the latest statistics before I hopped on this episode. Okay, so just like for a little bit of like materialist context, right? And I think this is why it is such a hard issue, that I think a lot of women who talk about transgenderism in women's only spaces, of which there are very few left, because of this, you know, the popularization of this sort of like non-binary movement. Why, like, we feel so terrified to talk about it outside those women's only spaces. And that's because, like, the material reality of our lives is that the biggest threat that we face, like the biggest threat to our safety, statistically speaking, right, is not fucking dying of COVID. It's not Islamic terrorist or whatever, right? It is male violence. Like, that is what it is. So I was looking at stats. Okay, 1 in 5 women will be raped in their lifetime. That's just in the US. Out of those rape victims, a third are either a child or a teenager. Overall, in the US, 25% of children are sexually abused during their childhood. And then I think on college campuses, it's 1 in 5 for the general population. I think it's like 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. Just on college campuses in the US, half of rape victims are raped by their partner. So it's not, you know, like the private is not a safe haven, right? Like the private is political. The private is also public in that sense, I guess. I think it's like every minute, about every minute that a woman is assaulted or raped, just in the US. So like, even just like to put it in perspective, right? Like this conversation, we're talking for probably like 90 minutes, 2 hours, right? So that means 100 women in the US will be raped or assaulted just in the space of this conversation. So to me, like, I don't know, just coming back to this idea of like gender and like performing or identifying, right, as some sort of transgressive act, like it's not, like that is not the material reality of women and girls in the US, and certainly not worldwide.
So, well, thanks, Jessica. I guess what I was thinking. Well, first, what I'll say is, you sent out some videos, and you posted or had us watch had me watch a YouTube video of radical feminist speeches,
Oh,
right? Yeah. And one of the things that was true and I think some of the things they said echo some of the things I've heard from you. I'm not going to say you would agree with them, or fully with them, but they sound similar. And I remember the context of that is they couldn't say what they were going to say unless they had police escorts there, right? Because there were activists who were saying you can't. These activists, essentially, to these women feminists who had been part of fights for abortion rights and fight for all sorts of things that I would agree with. You should fight for. They would be part of the left. There was a section of the left basically saying, you know, you can't come up here and say these things. And so what I appreciated was remembering that in some ways I used to think that way, like that you might, and that I've come some ways to basically say, no, that those folks are important. They've been part of the struggle, or whether you've been part of, it's important that these ideas get opened up, because, you know, how are we going to change the world if we can't talk about the world? And the world is understood in many ways, or part of the world is understood in gender terms. If I happen to feel like that actually does work against workers to see it in that binary way, and that's my view, because I'll say more about that later. But the fact is that it's important, and the fact is also, if I had just met you, if I was flying on the street around something, and you were like, well, no, transgender rights is a right-wing movement, I would have looked at you and I would have let that pass, but I would have been in my head, oh, that, you know, right winger, blah blah blah, right? And I would have written you off. It's fortunate that I do know you. It's fortunate that I'm in a better state of mind to say, look, where is this? I don't really know where this person's coming from. So I appreciate you saying that. While I don't agree with that, or rather, the things that I know or the things that I believe don't conform to me. Say, well, no, I think I don't want to agree when you say that it's oriented around in a right wing movement. I'm sure you've read stuff that can prove that, but I'm just saying I don't agree with that. But I do believe that what I saw in that woman's thing on YouTube was, I saw what looked to me like the dead end of identity politics, which is identity politics, which frames itself around we'll fight around our identities, and the identities will come together at some point, and we will fight our common oppressor. In reality, identity politics are divisive politics. And what I saw in that video was one identity movement that felt threatened by the existence of another identity movement. That's how I looked at it. And I see that with African, the struggle for Black liberation. And that often happens in the context of the fight for immigrant rights. You can see a similar thing where Black Native workers are being pitted against immigrant workers who said they're taking your job, or Native workers are picked against immigrant workers. And it's seen as if we're against each other. If you don't understand it, I would say if you don't understand it in a broader version than just identity. So that's how I viewed it, is what I saw there in that is that one, those people should be speaking. Let's should not say that they should have no right to speak. We should welcome that conversation, but I still will say that what I saw was for me, what the dead end of identity politics. And I would describe feminism as a version of identity politics that say that ultimately the divisions in society between men and women, because even in your own description there, when you talked about sexual abuse, I know that you obviously it was implied that doesn't include men, right? It was implied because there are many men victims of sexual abuse and when they're children. And it was implied even that rape doesn't include men. And I'm not saying it's more the majority, I don't know, but that was it. I would say that those sexual violence in society and gender roles and the fact that we cannot slide through gender things and really even the notion of being separated from yourself and wanting to figure out how to get closer to yourself, to me, is a function of alienation under capitalism. It's like what Marx talked about, alienated labor that leads to alienated workers, that leads to alienated from yourself. And these are what I think are at the root of people looking to find their better selves or their truer selves. And I do think James Corbett, even though Kenny and Jake, you don't see James Corbett, I do think ultimately the logic of what he's saying is no, get back to your gender. I feel is get back to your gender roles. Stay in your lane. Because I do believe a liberated society, I believe it would actually see, your sexual orientation as fluid, all these things that I can't remember who brought it up, that it's just a binary. I think all these things are free to be walked around. But if
your sex isn't.
Say again?
Your sex is not fluid.
I do believe it could be. Actually, it can. And in terms of I think even there's some scientific basis of not just this whole thing of XY and XX. There's people with XXY and XYY and XXX kind of things. And so there are different ways that physiologically children display different things, in terms of when they're first born. And then there is a notion, well, we've got to do an assignment. And all I'm saying is that the imposition of saying, no, we're gonna make it gender fluid from above, I don't believe in. But if there was actual class struggle, which there isn't, and class struggle does not mean electioneering, and I'm not even calling class struggle going out into the street. I'm saying in the context of genuine class struggle, where we were actually having to unite to fight our actual oppressors, then I actually believe that might produce a situation where we would actually see what kind of gender fluidity that movement might produce. That's not what's producing this thing that we're seeing. This is produced in the absence of class struggle and is being imposed as a capitalist attack on workers. But if workers did fight, and if workers were fighting against what we're seeing right now, and we're fighting collectively, and that would include people who do experience a sense of I don't know, I'm not comfortable with being called male, even though I look male, but I'm all youth. So I want to move over here and I want to be seen this way. I think that those people would be included in such a movement and would be part of such a movement. And we would figure out ways. And I personally think workers, in the same way that I feel hemmed in by QR codes, frankly, I feel hemmed in by mail. I do. It feels like a fucking prison. And so I hope that could be opened up. And frankly, the things that have come, some of those elements that I've heard from elements of that transgender movement have given me a sense of, oh yeah, I'd like that to be opened up, that space to be opened up. So I don't have this very conditioned response which I think was bred into me. I wasn't born with it, but bred into me through society and through a capitalist society that benefits out of dividing us into these gender roles. I would say we might look at sex differently, or we wouldn't care. We would just call ourselves humans. So maybe Jessica, if you want to respond to that.
Look like Kenny wanted to.
Oh
jump
God,
in.
I don't want to take up too much space.
Well, we
God, let me ask two really just like clarifying questions, and then I want to hear like other people's response. I mean, I'll respond if you want, but I disagree with almost everything. But I love that because usually I tend to agree with you, Andy. So I think it's good.
Here we are.
I just wanted to clarify one. You said feminism you see as kind of an expression of identity politics.
Yeah.
So I would like to know, would you not agree with the sort of Marxist feminist term of considering women a sex-based class who are oppressed on the basis of their sex, right?
Yeah, the division, the division between reproductive people who are reproducing, and yes, I do believe there is an oppression that comes out of class society.
Oh my gosh, I'm so jumbled. I don't know. Someone else go.
Kenny, why don't you give it a go, and then they can come in, and then Jessica, if you remember that question, we'll put it in and see if you can.
Yeah, and it's similarly to Lipson, that whole like I feel, oppress myself in certain ways. I'm not putting it in a hierarchy. Like that's the thing that I want to avoid in terms of my identity, and like growing up a male, whatever presenting person in this world. Because I grew up in a very violent society where there was definitely a lot of male abuse over women. And my mother herself, she fist fight men. She was strong. And I saw a lot of people, women, with that characteristics that we consider, very male, right? This binary. And so on the other side, like I grew up with a lot of men that were emotionally castrated. That's how I call it. And limited, in that way. And so that's why I play with this idea of, we're indoctrinated right into situations, and to see males see women as, a thing, property, a thing of consumption, of delight. And that's why I'm a Marxist revolutionary, because I do work in the community here. I've done a lot of work with, advocating for trans rights, with trans refugees who are the most abused on the path to the US. My partner herself, she's for years worked on that, and I've learned a lot about the struggles that, people that identify as trans suffer on the way. Most of them are whatever, biologically male, the transition to female, and I still don't get it right. I'm still learning. But long story short is that they still, faces the material conditions that makes their ability to liberate themselves hard. And so I think that's the pitfall of the left, that we engage in essentially culture wars. We want to change culture, and I don't judge myself from my standpoint. I don't see that ever changing unless we change the material conditions. But in the process, dealing with all this, like this, to me, what we're doing here is the struggle, having these conversations, but understanding that, for example, like my partner, she works in a nonprofit that she hates. She hates the nonprofit because she sees the capitalist structures, but there is a lot of abused women. And she understands that, that nonprofit system actually perpetuates violence. It will never solve the issue. It's just a band-aid, unless, like, as a Marxist, we eliminate private property somehow, figure it out. I don't have the roadmap, but unless everyone is guaranteed housing, regardless of your identity, so you can flee an abusive situation and liberate yourself. So you have options to do that. Unless we achieve that, that's why I'm a Marxist. I focus on the material, because that will set people free. Like, otherwise we will be playing saviors forever. And that's why I focus on Marxism, as a materialist, not so much on philosophical. Yes, we have to talk about theory, and it has to be in the hands of people, everyday people. It has to be palatable. That's why I do this show, because I want people to understand in like simple terms. I engage with my mother, with anybody, because that's a fundamental thing to me, that we can be. Unfortunately, there's so many layers of abuse, for so many people, and I used to pick and choose my battles. I've been environmentalist. I've been pro immigrant rights. I've been pro trans rights, and I've been pro against racism and all this stuff. But as a Marxist, that's what led me to where I'm at now. That I see the connection in the common oppressor on us. It's not even a person; it's a system. And unless we do away with that system, and it's going to take us understanding that's the goal, not changing culture. And the culture has to change organically from the bottom in the struggle, and understanding and finding trust in each other, and acceptance, even with people we don't agree, but understanding that our common North Star, is the same. And I think in that we will grow, or we won't. If we don't learn the lessons on the way, we're gonna fall, and that's what we're doing. And it's actually, we're digging deeper into, more cracks in the struggle on the left. We're the ones advocating for fascism, actually. Like, so watchful from the right. But I think it's a problem from the identities. Like I've personally, I've gone through so many like traumatic experiences, but I don't care to explain myself. I don't have to gain access. I shouldn't, and that doesn't define me. And, and so, again, that's why I'm a Marxist, and not so much, that's why I'm against identity politics, because I do see it as a divisive thing that, convolutes everything, that just makes it a mess. And it is basically what a friend said, it's just oppression Olympics. Who suffers the most? Let's just put the decks, or, Uno cards. And at that point, it's like no one wins, except the people at the top.
Jessica, you want to come back on any of this, and then I'm going to go to Jake.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about like the example of the shelters that you mentioned, Kenny, and like abused women, right, who need a space to go to feel safe and try to recover, like on a material level. And I'm thinking about the language, right? Because the language is really important for any issue, right? Like the framing. And for me, like the way, people make light of the trend towards sort of gender fluidity and non-binary language, right? Like with pronouns, with gender neutral terms kind of being implemented. Like right now, I know pretty recently in the UK, like the NHS, on all their materials, they've changed, like birthing mother is now birthing person, right? All of the, like, that's just one example out of many. And for me, like that is so much more serious than it seems on the surface, because, like several of you have mentioned, right? Like the importance of just having these conversations. And I think for women in particular, right? Like without sex specific language, like we no longer have the ability to sort of articulate our experiences, like our lived like material conditions. Like we can't advocate, we can't organize. Like without that language, it truly, like it really is an erasure. And then like with the example of shelters, and we could talk about like the implications of this stuff for like incarcerated women, right? Who are some of the most invisibilized, like voiceless people on the planet, right? And you now have gender ID laws, right? And like one of the first things that Biden did when he came into office, I think it was actually like the first day, maybe the second day that he was in office, right? Like he put through this gender identity executive order, right? And it basically replaced sex with gender identity. So every place in the law where you have language seeking to protect women as a group, as a class, like based on our biology, you now have it replaced with gender identity, right? Which they can't define. Like, as we've all said, like you how do you define gender? Like, how do you define identity? And it applies to every federal agency everywhere. Like, we're talking about government housing, we're talking about public homeless shelters, we're talking about women's shelters, like rape center, right? The whole public school system, anywhere that gets like federal money, basically, right? You now have a flattening, right? And yeah, I mean, I understand like the perspective, you know, like it started, I remember like years ago, like the first time I really started to think about this stuff was with like the bathroom issue, right? Of like, we need to have like sex neutral, like inclusive bathrooms, right? But when you actually see that, like how that plays out, you know, this happened at, I think it's, what is it? The Vancouver rape shelter, right? Like they've tried to shut that place down so many times because they will not let biological males, like transgender women, in, because it makes like these women have come in, right? Like undergone just some of the most traumatic experiences of their life, right? Being almost, you know, across the board, done by males, like by male violence, right? And so you could understand like why they would not want a biological male in that space. Same thing with prisons, right? Like, and there've already been like since Biden's executive order went through, there've already been alleged rapes, like at the Washington women's what is it, like the women's penitentiaries, and I don't know what it's called. California, you have alleged rapes. You have like the morning after pill being passed out, condoms being passed out in women's prisons. So think about like, you know, you're an incarcerated woman, which on average, like though that population has suffered by far the highest rates of sexual abuse. Like, you know, it's very, very likely that your average incarcerated woman has undergone that experience. And you imagine like being locked in, I don't know, an 8x10 cell with somebody who identifies as male, and may not even have undergone like any hormone, any surgeries, anything like that. Like they're just self-IDing, right? And I understand like we want to include everybody, right? But like this is a material issue for women like that. I don't know, I kind of went off. One thing I was going to ask you, Andy, the question I was going to ask you was about how you said sort of, you know, you see everything to sort of like the worker struggle, and this your goal, right, of like overthrowing our oppressors as working class people, as a proletariat, right? And I guess I would just posit with gender and sort of like this sex-based discussion, I think women would see men as our oppressors, right? And especially if I forget, I think Kenny said like, you know, obviously patriarchy goes back well before capitalism. I think it's like, to me, like this flattening of the gender spectrum is not like, it's an impediment. It's an impediment to liberation. It's not like the goal. And I mean, again, I would abolish gender altogether because I just don't think it serves us.
I can come back to that, what you're saying. Jake, do you want to take it from here?
You know, I'm gonna try to tie together what everybody's said so far, and which means I'm gonna be very brief and not very detailed.
That would be awesome. You could do that.
Well, so first of all, we all have different perspectives. There's places where we're agreeing, and there's places where we are maybe disagreeing or just not lining up. And one of the things, though, that I think I'm hearing us all sort of agree on is that, like, regardless of identity politics, regardless of gender, sex, race, class, we're all humans first. And, you know, that means that the way I see the identity politics and and I believe that some of the leading theorists would basically posit the same premise, is that whereas I would say that we are humans first, and then we are class, race, sex, gender, etc. They would say the opposite, that primarily I am first this identity category, and then therefore the dialectics of my identity group with others. This gets back to this idea of identities without essence, or we could even say dialectics without essence, is that the essence, the thing that would hold us all together, would be human in humanity. And that doesn't mean that, like, we have to define what it is human to be put in like a box. Like, I watched that Dave Chappelle, the most recent one he did. And what's interesting is, when I heard about it in the news, it's like, oh, he's really, bucking the transgender, paradigm with his, his brash comedy or whatever. But I don't know if anybody's seen it, but I didn't even see it that way. So the way that it was framed in the media tells me or confirms what I see as the whole politicization of it being used as a divisive weapon. But at the end of it, and I'll just skip to the whole narrative. He tells this long story about this transgender woman that he has this relationship with, this friendship with. And at the end, at one point, he says to her something like, hey, but I don't understand. I love you, but I don't get it. And she goes, I don't need you to understand me. I just need you to believe that I'm a human being having an experience. And so, right, believe that I'm human. So we can do that. Okay, we can all do that and not have to understand the other person and not have to get it right all the time. And this is called grace. This is where it encompasses compassion, sympathy, and also the freedom to be yourself. Now, where Jessica's saying though is like that sounds all nice and dandy in the abstract, but the examples that she's provided, like if you're a woman with female biology, and especially if you have been a victim of assault by male biology, and you're coming off of that, and you're in a space like a halfway house or a jail, like to have those biological body parts in that space with you, which is a strange place where you probably don't feel safe, even if it was just women, because you're coming out of this traumatic experience. And it's a precarious situation if it's a halfway house, if it's a prison, right? You're not feeling welcome anyways, right? Like, I don't know how this the idea of just believe I'm a human and get along, when we talk, as she framed it, the material consequences of these different biological realities in these spaces, like that's something that I don't know that you can actually, just change your perception about it, right? And so in that regard, I get what Jessica's saying, and to that extent, I don't know that you can. You can definitely play with gender fluidity, but I don't know that you can play with the sex fluidity in the sense that, right? Like, if I'm that woman in that space, there's nothing that's not going to see that body part as the weapon that was used against me, and a potential real life threat. So I mean, I think there's a material consequence of that cannot be avoided by any framing of language or philosophy. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's confused about what a woman is when she's being raped. Nobody's confused about what a woman is when she's giving birth. I don't know. Go ahead, Kenny.
I wanted to say, about those places of, where people are trying to heal, and you referenced Jessica, and again, that's why I bring it back to democratizing, society. Again, my partner has been working at democratizing that community, fighting against the nonprofit industrial complex, because they just impose people on these communities who themselves are the source of their own healing. They know, like an outsider who went to school with some theory, like won't know that, right? That's another level of identity there. Like the differences, even if you have the same parts, if you've never been raped, you can never relate to someone who has been raped. So again, for me, it's about democratizing the processes, taking control of our own communities and environments. Like those people in this particular place that I have in mind, where my partner works, that they themselves are agents of their own healing, in whatever they decide in their community. If they don't want any male parts, that's their decision, and so it still comes back to me to taking over our own communities, our own lives, and changing the material realities, putting them in a democratic process, not in these impositions, these hierarchies, these dictatorships that we're all subjected to. And so that's all I want to say about that.
And can I and then just to add one other thing that I probably should have added to is like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jesse, but what I don't hear, just like I didn't hear Corbett saying like, no, you must be binary. I don't necessarily hear Jessica saying that everybody, that transgender people can't exist, but it's just that she wants to be able to, that there should be something that is female and then a space for females in the same way that there can be something that's transgender and a space for transgender. And then obviously a common space where we all get along, but obviously in the sense that there is diversity, right? There's spaces where we can be unique in our diversity. And again, if I put words in your mouth, you tell me I'm wrong, but this is to me the puzzle, right? It's like, because in order to not end up like, as I framed it in the beginning, where everything is an identity without essence and everything gets blurred together, and there is no uniqueness of man or woman or trans or black or white or whatever, historically or culturally or biologically, then we actually don't have diversity. We just have commodified people. We literally have human beings becoming products, like commodified, homogenized, like mass manufactured on a like a factory belt. So
Jessica, you want to respond to that? I mean, I do have a thing I'm thinking, but I don't want to give you a chance to.
Well, yeah, I mean, I hope it goes without saying that I support human rights. I don't think anyone should ever be denied safety or food or shelter or community on the basis of like how they identify or what they wear or what they believe or any of that. Like, of course not. But I think sometimes it gets framed as like a human rights issue, and I'm not sure that it is. And I also want to say, like, in line with all of my previous opinions on other episodes about like the vaccination and masks and all of this, like I fully support everyone's right to bodily autonomy. Like, you should be able to do whatever you want with your own body. I do think there's I question surgeons and medical practitioners who are willing to cut into perfectly healthy flesh, sometimes children's bodies. To me, that seems a violation of the do no harm contract. And I question, although I think, there's obviously massive amounts of cultural pressure and indoctrination, I do question parents' decisions to allow people to do that to their children, and you can't really separate like the trans movement in its current state from the medical industrial complex. Like, I mean, that is the reality of it. I mean, unless you're just like, obviously it is actually like pretty popular to just sort of like identify as non-binary, maybe use they pronouns, whatever, like, but you don't actually undergo any like physical or medical interventions. But in terms of like actually trying to change your own body, I mean, like the effect of these types of medical interventions, right? Like puberty blockers and hormones and surgeries, like they have material, like permanent material effects, right? Like sexual dysfunction, infertility, reduced brain development, mental illness. Sometimes, like a lot of these kids especially they're on psychiatric drugs, like alongside the hormones or whatever they're taking, and it adds up to like a lifelong dependency on the medical system, right? Like that shit is permanent. The young girls, right? And this is like it's interesting, like Kenny, how you mentioned like that your partner, like most of the trans individuals that you're referencing, I'm assuming are like adult age, are male to female, and that has traditionally been the pattern for decades. And it's also been like a really, really, really small like fraction of the population up until very, very recently. I mean, like kids would have gender dysphoria, but it would, in the grand majority of children, like that would just resolve itself. It was a very, very, very tiny sliver of the population. I think it's like maybe like 0.01%, like a tiny fraction of a percentage, and it was mostly boys. But then in the last, like, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years, it's just the gender patterns have like completely flipped. And now you have this like epidemic of really, really young girls seeking medical intervention to, supposedly like become boys. I think in the UK it's like over 4,000% increase just in the past decade. I'm not sure what it is in the US. And so I think like with that, I mean, these girls they're never going to be able to have a child. Many of them they'll never be able to have an orgasm, right? And I think again, like these are young kids in some cases. And you have like a lot of I don't know if I'd say a lot, but there are some like detransitioners, right, who are starting to speak up and about like the effect that this has had on their bodies, like autoimmune conditions, severe depression. The list goes on. Like you can't actually like detransition fully, right? So I just would, in terms of transhumanism, but even just on the face of it, like I think we have to also kind of square this with our critiques and prior like disdain for the medical industrial complex. Like how do you square that with this movement? And again, like you should be able to do whatever you want to your body. Like if I want to chop my arm off or kill myself, I think I should be able to do that. But it's not. A lot of times it's like a 14-year-old like having a double mastectomy. Like what are the ethics of that? I think it's really scary.
Yeah, and I think so. I want to tie the two complexes you brought together, which was the state complex when you mentioned a figure like Joe Biden, making changes, and then you're talking about the medical industrial complex, which I agree with you. We can really see today how this thing operates as part of a dictatorship, really, right? As part of a way of it's part of the matrix of a current tyranny that many of us are experiencing. And the framework that I think about as I think about Joe Biden saying, I'm going to we're going to help create these avenues for transgender people here. Or when I think about the biomedical industry saying, we're going to help you do things, I think of imperialism. I think there is a legacy of empires controlling foreign populations by picking one group that is under the boot, but we're going to lift you up, and then we're going to use you to smash the rest, and we'll smash you, by the way. So there's a long tradition of British Empire, of U.S. Empire, Chinese Empire, or Russian Empire, we understand that process as a colonial process outside of our country. But it's not a process just outside of our country. It exists That colonial rule exists within our country, and our ruling classes, and I would call Joe Biden part of our ruling class, I would call the biomedical complex part of that, had no interest in liberating transgenders when they made transgender bathrooms, when they decreed it. It's part of our common enslavement. It's part of our common divide. It is a conscious divide and conquer strategy that they're using to divide people, to divide left and right, to separate women from another oppressed sect. I would describe. I actually think these are natural allies being divided, and so there is no liberation out. And you're completely right, Jessica, to be very cynical of because it's coming from the top, and the only thing, and these are the same people who brought us the scamdemic, the plandemic. Like, how are these people instituting tyranny across the board, but they're allowing this transgender liberation movement through it? There's no way that's like, everyone's getting smashed. It's just they're going to use, and they're going to lift different groups to smash all of us as well as them. And that's personally the dynamic that I believe is in play, because the questions you're asking are legitimate ones, but they can't be answered by the ruling class, and they can't be answered by whatever the ruling class is doing, because they're not looking for those answers. That kind of question you're asking about, well, what would you do about women who've experienced rape? How would they? What would be that relationship between a person who was identified as a man, or has been identified as a male, but who that themselves believes that they're a woman and identifies as a woman? If that movement, if those questions were actually in an actual movement that we were a part of, and then I think we would come up with different answers than just like, here's what we're going to do. We're imposing this. We're coming up with that. So the complexity of the question can only be answered out of, in my opinion, out of working class struggle. And there is not working class struggle in this country out of which such questions are being posed and answered. We are completely divided. And in fact, the divisions have grown as different ethnic groups or oppressed groups are being plucked out, raised up, and then thrown down and discarded later, just so they can divide us. And partly just so they can divide us, and partly so they can refashion their legitimacy and say, you need us. And lastly, offer people the idea of individualized liberation, which is a myth. No one on this kind of tyranny can liberate themselves just by like, oh, I'll find this way. I'll get this sort of change made. I'll take these sorts of drugs. I'll do this sort of thing. And I'll think this about myself. I'll call myself this. I'll use this pronoun, and liberation will somehow, that's my way. There is no way through language. There's only one way, which is the collective struggle to remove the capitalist class. Unless it's part of that, then there's no liberation. And the liberation comes out of what Kenny was saying. How do we actually overcome these divisions that do exist, that have been put between us as well? How do we overcome that and actually challenge the power which is getting over on us on the basis of those divisions?
I gotta say something here, which is where, and fits with some of the other points that the framework I had set up. And we all know, right? I'm not a Marxist, right? And so y'all believe that the material dialectic comes first and the ideas come after. But right now, what are we doing? We're trying to solve the problem with ideas, right? Like this particular problem actually does require the ideas to precede. And I'm not saying that there's not a material dimension to that, but I'm saying that before you can organize all these different groups in terms of material, like we could find some solidarity as working class people, but the only way for these different groups to see that the human community and the working class community is the first category is to have this dialogue of ideas first, right? Because some of these different identity groups are not thinking about it in terms of class. So, if to the extent that you can galvanize some working class movement, the people that see themselves primarily as race, class, sex, gender, right? They're not going to be in there. So I would differ on that. I mean, even Marx himself, right? Like, first of all, his idea came from Hegel, which was ideas. I know he inverted it, but then the revolutions and the different working class movements came out of Marx's ideas, right? Marx wasn't necessarily out there on the ground. I mean, him and Engels were, pushing that movement, but it was his literature, right? It was his words, his ideas that sort of spun. So I want to hear what you and Kenny have to. Yeah, Kenny. Yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, and that's why I say that theory has to be in the hands. Like Rosa Luxemburg would talk about. Like we can't just bastardize and relegate this the world of ideas to the academics and the experts. This has to be in everyday people. That's why I work in simplifying, and making approachable, right? Like versus just being very academic. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I do. Where I put an emphasis on the material is that in the struggle, in the actual, on the way to change things is where we will see the reality of things. Like where we exchange ideas, where we disagree. That's when because we can theorize, but in practice, if we don't practice it, that's where we're going to have to adapt and come up with new strategies, or listen to different groups in the struggle. And if we're not able to come together, if we end up oppressing another group in that struggle, then I don't want to be part of that. Then call me an anarchist. Like but I mean, I'm a Marxist, revolutionary socialist, whatever, but because I believe that it takes the collective. Individuals can't change anything, and my ideas can be powerful right now, but like if people don't actually find that useful in practical, real terms, and if we don't have produced material, changes that are tangible, no one's gonna follow you. And so that's why I put an emphasis on materialism, and because I do believe that in that process, culture will change. But I think that's what's inverted right now, that they want to change culture. A lot of people that do it out of good heart and well-meaning want to change culture and expect power to change. No, we have to go for power. And that's what Rosa Luxemburg would talk about, who's one of my biggest influences, that it's about power. It's about the collective democratic power, to truly do the things that we want to do. Otherwise we're just following into the trap, and that's what this is. That's why I do agree with, in a way with Corbin, that I do see the link between this and transhumanism. But I also, maybe to like, we can jump into that if you want, but even transhumanism, what is that? And I think that's also a pitfall of us thinking of, this future that we're talking about, right? The QR code future, the techno-fascist future, as being this one solid thing that's distinguishable. But I actually think transhumanism is here in some ways. We're already plugged into the system. Our bodies a lot of us spend most of our day detached from our bodies, living through these screens. So it's already here. It's just, but I think that's a pitfall of imagination, to think that it's just this one movie-like future. But it's slowly just solidifying. It's an abstraction right now. And so, sorry, maybe I'm just jumping around, but I do think, I don't know, sorry.
I want to agree with you real quick, which is, and I want to caveat what I just said to synthesize, because, right, like when I say ideas, I don't mean ideology, and you're right, and I'm guilty of being overly verbose and jargon filled with, when I try to explain things in terms of ideas. And like right now, like if you crystallized a working class ideology and tried to beam it through all these Zoom meetings, that's not going to do anything. Even if somehow the ideology was right, it needs to happen in human space with human interaction, and those ideas, not ideologies, being developed through the human experience, and that has to be in human space. So that's the material part of it, where you're actually interacting with people in physical space. So I just wanted to add that, like to say that, I'm not saying that, we just, we all got the right ideas, everything changes. There is a synthesis there between the two. Yeah. And it does need to be organic and not, go ahead.
And I call that socialism. I call that communism. Just to be clear, that's, maybe I'm very simplistic in my understanding of it, and that's what it's going to take, not some expert telling me some bullshit that, it'll take people becoming experts themselves and having an opinion and being empowered to say something and determine their own, shaping their own communities, and running their own lives.
Jessica.
Oh, you go. You go. I talk too much.
No, I want to. I think it's. I want to hear what you have to say about where you want to take it. I'm going to respond to Jake's thing about what comes first, chicken or the egg, and I'm going to be the opposite.
About ideas versus. Yeah, you go first then.
Okay. Well, I'll see if I cut. Okay. Well, Marx had no impact, very little impact on the struggles in England and even in Germany of the workers. He was a biographer of it, and he was being influenced by their actions. So the workers who were fighting the capitalists and they're fighting their bosses didn't really know Marx. They probably knew people like Charles Owen and Fourier more than Marx. Marx merely saw himself as a scientist studying the society and saying, I believe, based on some previous people who had said these things, that society is divided in classes. And so you're right, though, Jake. Marx was trying to get at the idea of what does it mean to be human. And he saw the fundamental thing in being human was what you do, which I'm not sure I fully agree with. I also think it's what you think. But fundamentally, what made us human is what we do. And the alienation that workers experience is increasingly what you do is being controlled. And the products of what you do you're separated from it. The fact that you are just one little piece of a part and you don't even know what that part is. The fact that you are separated from workers, and the fact that products themselves that you build come back and replace you. Like he described that process of alienation as deeply disruptive to the human spirit. But I do believe actions come before ideas, and I do believe that ideas are a product of actions, and that's so. But why is this space important? Mostly for me, just to give people the chance to say your ideas matter. Whether you agreed with Jake, whether you agree with Andy or Jessica or Kenny or none of us, your ideas matter because we're workers, and it's going to be it will be the synthesis in moving together as we discuss what we think, whatever that produces. That's those sets of ideas that exist in that diversity. That's what I'm fighting for, is the process of that finding expression. Because none of us believe it can be beamed in anybody's heads, whether we, so that's what I would say is, and I believe if we take action, when people take action, they'll do so far in advance of what their own ideas are. Like their actions will be ahead of their ideas, and it'll be in the discussions that those and of them trying to figure out what they're actually doing and how do they deal with the capitalists fighting back. That I do believe an ideology of liberation can be born out of that. That will have to take up the kinds of questions Jessica's asking, and that the women at that conference were raising, that are not legitimate. Like I don't have answers to those, but they do require answers, because a person who has been harmed like that does have to have a place where they can go and commiserate and heal with other people who've been similarly harmed. All right, Jessica.
I don't know where I would stake my claim in the sort of chicken and egg question that you guys are.
You can don't feel like you have to either weigh in on if you have a thoughts on it. But
I'll just say something quick, and then I maybe wanted to pick up on like the direction Kenny was going, and maybe that'll take us to the next. I don't know how much longer I want to go for it. But I just to say, like, with this sort of synthesis, I mean, just for me personally, like some of the most liberatory moments have been reading, like embedded in, a world of ideas, as some people would see it. I mean, I always love that. Milton, going way back, Milton's Areopagita, where he says like books are living things, like they're living, breathing souls. And so I mean, to me, it's like that's almost material. Like I don't even see that act. And same thing with like conversations. I don't even see it as sort of like fully in the world of ideas. And I mean, I remember the first time I read like a radical feminist text, since we're on kind of that subject, like I physically felt just like a weight lifted, this sort of like, ideology, but it physically sort of alleviated certain feelings of guilt and alienation and confusion, like from my body, like on a material, biological level of like, oh, like this, all of this like bad crap that I have experienced or has crossed my mind or whatever, like it's not all just me and like my fault and my imperfections, and you know, like it's not so much of it is it's systematic, like it's manufactured. And maybe kind of like to transition to like this whole more of like the transhumanism side, and like can you just, you know, talking about like being human, right? um you know, I completely agree, like we are already in transhumanism, like yeah, okay, factory farm workers, right, like being treated like robots, like their arms are literally mechanized, Amazon workers in assembly lines, QR codes crossing borders, all of this, like digital ID seems like implemented more and more like by the day. But I also think like even just like I think Andy and Kenny both said at one point like you feel caged by being male or have felt that way at some point. And I think as much as all of the sort of like robot mechanization stuff, which has been going on for so long, um I think that's just as fundamental to transhumanism, this like disembodiment and like I mean that's fucking sad, like it's sad hearing you guys say that, and it's such a testament to how successful the capitalist project and the transhumanist project has been already, that they have made us feel almost like hate for our own bodies. And I mean, you guys feel like that. Imagine what it's like to be like a 10-year-old girl. Like, no wonder they want to become boys. Like, no wonder people want to have plastic surgeries and, you know, all of this. Like, we've been conditioned to hate our like most precious life-giving, you know, material like flesh. I think that's like, you know, almost like a bigger testament than anything. And I think that's like the biggest thing that I want to resist, you know. I think we need to all sort of, I don't know, like figure out ways to kind of change that relationship that we have to ourselves, right? And like to be more human. And I know Kenny, like you have maybe some examples of that in your recent trip.
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to share, I would. I mean, I some people probably heard my episode, you know, about my cousin, about traveling to Canada and basically being forced to get vaccinated, not finding a way to get there, with the time pressure, because my cousin had cancer and he was deteriorating really fast, and so he passed away last Sunday, not this Sunday, the Sunday before, December 5th. I will remember that forever. And so yeah, I traveled to Canada, QR codes, you know, and in that episode I said that the reason I was going, and that regardless if whether I got to see my cousin alive one last time, I would still value that experience, because I felt that you know, in this struggle that we're in with these QR codes, these dehumanizing things that we're being subjected, you know, these identity things, proving who we are, right? Proving that we have the key for the lock and key system, has been dehumanizing and isolating it. And so yeah, got there and got to spend time with people, with family, and got to grieve, got to cry, got to touch my cousin's body one last time, got to say goodbye to him, got to put him in the earth, you know, and also got to share with all the lives that he touched, you know, in person, not through FaceTime, you know, not through an avatar, you know, not through Zoom, you know, in person. And that to me is valuable. You know, it has a grounding effect as a human, you know, and that to me is what's at stake with what we're talking about, right? Like that experience, you know, of being human, and in many ways we are sold, I feel, that the idea that we can transcend that, right? That experience, that we can be beyond that, because I do think that capitalism sells us this horrible relationship to life, and death, which is part of life. The fact that we age, the fact that we are not perfect, the fact that we're flawed, in I do have said that in previous episodes that I try to lean on Buddhist principles, of basically acceptance. That we get old, we get sick, we age, and we die. And in that same space, of having this the strongest human experience I've ever had, because I never lost someone so close. At the same time, I was horrified because I saw the kids, the younger ones, kids under 9, communicating through an app. They all had cell phones or iPads. They all created avatars that did not resemble themselves. Brown kids, with having avatars with green eyes, in like blonde, and it makes me think of another episode of Second Life, which was like a platform where people could live an entire life, and and again, this is not new. And I remember playing video games and making our own, baseball players or soccer players. This is not new, but it's more insidious and it's becoming more clear, materializing. And that's what I understand as transhumanism, or at least the initial steps of seeing those kids experiencing life through a screen, and in that way, like, they are connected. I think of the movie The Matrix. They are connected to the Matrix. I mean, we do it too, but they are getting the young ones. That's who they really want. We've discussed this on the show, and John, you've wrote a book about education and technology, and that's what saddened me, because I had these two realities, right? And that's like the dividing line for me. Like this human experience that I as hurtful, as painful as it was, it's what being human is about. It's where it's what I think distinguishes us from animals, I guess. People can make that argument. But then we have this other experience that I don't know how these kids are going to grieve in the future. Or if they will, learn that, or but I was also hopeful because my partner came with me, and she understands, she engages, she doesn't dive as deep as we do on these topics, and sometimes she doesn't understand everything we talk about, but she understands humanity. She understands the human experience. She saw them and she said, fuck this. And she worked so hard to gain the kids' trust, because the kids were just like ignoring her at first, but she worked so hard to gain their trust until she got them to play and throw the iPads away. So that's what gives me hope. That there's still people that care, the people that value, this human experience, and that means getting hurt, that means getting up after getting hurt, that means messing shit up, making mistakes, that means accepting that you're flawed and struggling to accept yourself more and more. And I just want to honor my cousin in that sense. And I'm sorry if I get emotional. All that to say is that we were not supposed to have more than 50 people at that venue. And we had 100 plus. Because my cousin, he was imperfect. He was flawed. He had demons inside. He was this macho man that probably caused harm, to women. But he also loved, he was this complex being. He touched people. He associated with, the poorest and the richest. And he didn't know theory or politics. And yet he touched so many people. He showed up for people. And so he also played soccer. He was good at it. And the point is that at some point it was beautiful because, in that people clapped clap for his life because he closed the circle. He left in peace. My cousin, I feel like he found an enlightenment. He left in peace and he told his brothers, take it easy, be calm. I'm good. And that is the human experience. Like I'm hurt right now, but I'm also happy for him because he struggled for that thing that humans struggle for, I think. Well, at least I hope we do, to wrestle with our demons, to, come to terms with our lives. And I just think that's beautiful. And like in the context of all this bullshit, of having to show who you are and like picking in a gang or where you belong to, I think his story, this flawed being, coming to peace and making peace with everyone that he had hurt, or at least most people, it's beautiful. And that's what I fight for, That's why I went to Canada. I went out, and even though I dealt with all the QR bullshit, the vaccine bullshit, I'm glad I went there because it gave me fuel again to fight for what we're fighting for, which is our own humanity.
Yeah, I just want to say you touched on something that is profound, which is we're talking a lot about rights and human rights, and a lot of times that means like the right to have your space and to be safe and to be validated. But your full humanity is really the right, like you said, to be flawed, to make mistakes, to struggle. And even if you could somehow be put in some pod where everything was constantly copacetic and you had all your needs met all the time, that would not be human. And so that's very profound, and I just wanted to touch on that. And thanks for sharing.
Yeah, ditto. I think one of the worst crimes from the past 2 years is, so many of the people who have died of COVID or with COVID, right, have been like the elderly in nursing homes or hospitals, and so many of them had to die alone, probably surrounded by beeping machines and people in masks and God knows what, and also like the people that they left behind who didn't get to say goodbye, who didn't get to grieve them properly, who didn't get to hold their hand or touch them. And I think, it's just such a crime. Like it's not right. And yeah, it shouldn't have been allowed to happen. Like to die with dignity too. Like I think that's one of the fundamental like desires that we all have as humans, and we should have that, right?
And certainly you should have people who care about you around you when that happens. I don't give a fuck about infection fatality rate.
The one guarantee in this life was none of us was getting out alive. Now I know the transhumanists, especially at the top of the pyramid, right? They would like that, but all you can hope for is to live a life with dignity, and that doesn't mean that everything goes your way and you do it perfect all the time. That means that you pick yourself back up, that you find meaning in your suffering, and you basically carry your cross. And I think there's something. The people that want to live forever, I think that that is intimately tied to their misanthropy. Like we talk a lot about racism and misogyny, but like at the top of it, they hate humanity. Like they hate the fact that humans are flawed, and they want to reimagine that, to use their language. And that's not to make it better. That's not to, they might say it's to perfect it, but it's really to annihilate what it means to be human. And so
it's so funny that like, the whole idea of transhumanism is like to transcend like the so-called limitations of the body and, our mortality. It's like they're so scared of death. But the whole agenda is like so against life, and I feel like it's, embedded in that whole like capitalist framework and certainly transhumanist framework, it's just such a contempt like for the body, like we've talked about, for human connection, and then also like for the land, right? Like that's kind of like the eco-feminist analysis, which I think is really important in all of this, and maybe haven't touched on, like thinking about like the figure of the mother, right, related to sex or gender, the human mother, and then the motherland, right? And just as you like mine for resources, right, which is like marring the land, it's like violating it in that process. You mine the body too, right? Like whether it's for labor, like labor, or like reproductive labor, productivity, capital, data now, right? It's like how many ways can you find to exploit the human body? And then like with nature, like ecosystem services and financialization of nature and all of this that we've talked about before, right? Like turning the land into a machine and then turning the body into a machine, and then they call it like transcendence, right? As if it's some sort of like spiritual or religious attainment or something, like rather than the exploitative like anti-life agenda that it is really, right? Like, and I think this is why they hate, like transhumanists hate women. They hate the earth. They hate the human body, the natural immune system, right? Like they hate birth, they hate death, everything innately human and everything innately like imperfect, as you said, Jake. Which to me is like everything innately beautiful, right? And maybe, part of why they hate it so much is because it is so powerful, and it's like it's a power that they can never really measure up to, and it's threatening in that way, and especially like, a woman, right? Like we have the power to create life, right? Which to me, like, that's almost the greatest power that you could have, at least on the earthly plane or whatever, right? All the technology in the world, all the capital, like that can never replicate what it is to be alive, and whether that's like a woman giving birth, like in her own power, giving birth to her child, or it's a tree, like purifying the air that we breathe, or healthy food, like coming out from healthy soil, or a bee pollinating a flower, or, like grieving the loss of somebody that you love. Like these things are real and beautiful, and that should be enough. That should be enough. And that to me is like what's so hard to understand about transhumanism. It's like, you get a body, like you get to be here and have an immune system and connect to your fellow human beings, many of us for like 80 years. Like that's amazing. Like why can't that just be enough?
Kenny, I think we might be wrapping up here, and Kenny, I want to see if you have any last thoughts.
My cousin, like I said, just again, because this is very personal, he lived a life, and he only lived 38 years, but he had a full life. And at the end, he made peace with things, and he has a video, of that we played at the funeral, and where he talks about not waiting for things to be perfect to smile. If you're waiting for things to be perfect to smile, then you're wrong. And that's all I wanted to say, because that's what I remember from him.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I met Sergio. And I met him in Nicaragua. And we were racing down a hill that was very muddy, very dangerous to go walking down, and he was having a lot of fun. And I slipped and he laughed, but he also helped me. So
that was him.
I think I'll leave it at that. We'll call it at the episode. And I just want to say thank you all for doing this. I know I was nervous. Jessica, you were a little nervous. Jake was a little nervous. I don't know if Kenny, but I appreciate you all. And I appreciate being in this we're in boxes here. I did get to see Jake. I'm really happy, Jake, you visited at one time. Remember way back when, you know, that. And Jessica, there's going to have to become a day where we actually meet in person.
Yeah, we're not that far of a drive.
I know.
After the snow clears the mountain passes, I'm down for a meetup.
But I think, nevertheless, even over this remote thing, I feel like something's been being built. So I really appreciate you all being part of this. So that does it for this week's episode. Jessica, Jake, and welcome back, Kenny. But thank you all again for being here. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog, what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast channel there, or connect with us there. I remind folks, if you enjoyed this episode or any previous episode we've had, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our 8 platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and channels Bitchute, Odysee, YouTube, or Telegram. If you'd like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. But until then, again, Jake, Jessica, thank you. Kenny, welcome back. And we'll see you all next week.
Much love.